This podcast is sponsored by ORCHSE Strategies, an industry leader in developing innovative and sustainable approaches for protecting workers and the environment. ORC membership includes EH&S vice presidents, directors, and senior managers from over 120 large global corporations in 20 different industry sectors. Many member companies like General Electric and Alcoa and GM and ExxonMobil and DuPont and Duke Energy and Siemens Healthcare Diagnostics and Allergen and Procter & Gamble and 3M have very well-established reputations as industry leaders in EH&S. That's like reading the greatest hits list. The value provided by the organization comes from harnessing the collective wisdom of all of these members and from the guidance and facilitation and expertise from the staff with decades of experience in EH&S. If you're interested in learning more about the unique opportunities available through ORCHSE, please contact Linda Haney at 202-510-0509. Or you can pop Linda an email at linda.haney@orchse.com. That's Linda, Linda.Haney, Haney, at orchse.com. Now, the podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the PreAccident Podcast. I'm your host, Todd Conklin. Thank you for being you and also for listening and being a part of the podcast and doing all the cool stuff you do as a podcastarian, a podcasterist, a podcasterin, a podcastee. I'll have to kind of work through this. Hey, what do you think? Man, is the world not crazy? It just seems crazy. It's every day's kind of nutty, but we are deep into my favorite time of the year, which is the interlock and the land between the holidays and when things slow down and the beginning of the year. I know some of you aren't slowed down, so my sympathy goes with you. But right now, just trying to figure out trying to make sense of the world around me and enjoying a little bit of home time, which is, totally worth it. I can't even tell you how nice it is. Because I get to hang out and I get to do stuff and I don't have to drive from the airport to the hotel, that kind of stuff. I don't know if you have that kind of life, but I do. Many of you who listen to this podcast do. And it's just a part of the job. I'm not complaining, but I'm just saying it's really nice when you get a little time off. And I hope you enjoyed your time off. I am. I'm having lots and lots and lots of fun. That's for sure. So what can we talk about? Well, we're almost towards the new year, and I'll be rolling out a brand new theme that I'm going to accomplish in the new year. And it's not going to be slow down and enjoy, because I sucked at that. I couldn't have been worse at slowing down and enjoying than I was at slowing down and enjoying. I was terrible at slowing down and enjoying. But hopefully this new theme will be doable, manageable, and will move me forward. I know that's going to be on the charts at some point. So we'll talk more about that as it progresses. Today's podcast is an interview with the single crappiest internet service I've ever had, bar none, and I live in New Mexico. That's saying something. But it's an interview with a guy named Robert Sams, and he wrote a book called Social Sensemaking, a reflective journal on how we make sense of risk. And these new discussions around risk, seeing risk really more as a construct that's socially negotiated, is way interesting to me. Traditionally we've seen risk as something you could actually measure, and you could quantify it. You could put a number on it. You could call it a 7 or a 9, or you could call it a red, a green, or a yellow. You could call it a high or a low. But in fact, the more we think about risk, the more we think about the fact that it's not a social, it's not a metric. It's a social construct. It's something that we make up. It's hard to measure it because it's different for different people. The best example I can think of is, remember when you first started driving, the first time you drove on a big road? Was it risky? Was it scary? It was pretty scary because you hadn't been driving very long. Now think of last week when you drove on a big road. Was it as risky as it was the first day you drove on it? And the answer is going to be no, it wasn't. That's kind of a part of this notion of social construct. You're going to hear Robert talk about lots of people. Edgar Schein, been on the podcast. Carl Weick, he's going to be a big discussion. And Carl is someone that we ought to get on the podcast. I will make that happen, actually. I'm going to make myself a note now. Call Carl Weick. Okay, I just wrote that down. This podcast really is kind of a romp through those ideas. So sit back and relax and see what you think. Nobody's trying to change anybody's mind, but we're definitely trying to sort of figure out how we think about safety, big S or small s, that's coming up, and how we think about risk. And one of the best discussions on it, the best little journeys around the risk is Robert's book. So he'll talk about it more, but for now, sit back and relax and enjoy Robert Sams on risk. Maybe most people that listen to the podcast may not know you, and it's their chance to get to know you.
Yeah, good day. I suspect they don't, so it's probably a dead giveaway from the accent that I live down here in Australia. I live in a country town just a couple of hours north, as it is, of Sydney. And in terms of, I like to introduce myself, I guess, socially. So I'm a husband to my wife, Dee, a pretty happy and a dad to my daughter who's just turned 13 now, Laura. And, my work is really, I'm being very fortunate enough to work in a field, particularly in the last few years, that's also a passion. So whilst most of my life has been spent working in what I guess I call safety with a capital S, the last couple of years have really been a resurgence for me into better understanding people. And I realised what I missed out on in all those years of working in safety, which was really a connection and an understanding with people. So I guess if, in short, I work now consulting mainly, but I guess I'd rather think about it as I work in an industry that's about people support. And most of my days, or most of my working days, I enjoy getting it out and having really good conversations with people and understanding how things work for them.
So what's the difference between safety with a capital F, S, not F, God, what am I saying? Safety with, you can tell it's 10 o'clock at night, safety with capital S and safety with a small s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I try and use the word capital S, and it's certainly not my idea. As people will get to know me, the study I've done in the last few years is under a guy called Dr. Rob Long, and really it's his idea that I'm borrowing, with permission, of course. And I guess the idea is the industry of safety I try to use with a capital S. And when I critique that industry, an industry that I've been a big part of and has been a big part of my life, so I critique it. When I critique it, I critique myself, I guess, in some ways. But I try to do that and give it a name as a noun so that it's not a personal attack on people working in the industry, or because I think that's a big challenge when trying to provide a critique and trying to provide a deep insight or at least a challenge to what's currently happening. So I deliberately try and do that by giving safety that name, if you like, as opposed to what others might call safety as a value or an outcome, which is not the way that I see the world now.
I really appreciate what you're saying. When you think about it and you think about the way safety's moving, what do you think is happening that's caused this kind of new, invigorated discussion around safety really as a capacity, as something we do and manage in real time, as opposed to seeing safety as an outcome? What do you think caused this discussion?
Look, I'd love to know the answer to that. And we were just talking a moment ago about Ed Kashine saying it's about coming to the realisation it's more about the questions and the answer. And I think that question comes with some answers that I've kind of worked through in the last few years, and it also has many more questions that I'm still trying to work out. But the answers, or maybe I prefer to think of them as what I've discovered, I think, is that it became overly focused, I think, safety, that is, with a capital S, overly focused on objects, overly focused on viewing people as part of a system. And really, if I can give an indication of my training, which was a university training in safety, it was focused on the law, on sciences and on objects. And in a 6-year undergraduate degree, I learnt nothing about people and decision-making. And I really do think that there's a greater desire from those working in the industry now to better understand people, and recognising that most curriculums, most teaching in safety misses that, or at least the traditional approach to that has missed understanding of people. And I think it's a huge gap.
Do you think it's because the belief that the law itself doesn't make a system more safe, that's starting to sort of creep into the dialogue? Because I'm really curious about this, because compliance clearly matters. We have to have a standard. I mean, there's a standard by which we perform the work we do and a standard by which we expect people to perform the work they do. But I think the belief that somehow the standard was sufficient, that the standard would actually provide safety if you were legitimate, if you were law-abiding, then you would therefore be safe. And I think people are really struggling with the fact that you can be really law-abiding. You could have super low incident numbers and still have a catastrophic failure.
Yeah. One of the great learning, maybe a better way to put it, a great pondering for me in recent years and realisation is this whole idea of paradox and the fact that we have to constantly hold a paradox between being, if you like, using the word compliant and at the same time being creative and innovative and if you like, risk. And I think we can get our heads around the fact that the two things need to coexist. We need to have a process, and in the language of safety differently, which I know you're familiar with, safety 1 and 2 coexisting, not one or the other or binary. And maybe there's a safety 3 and 4 and a safety 1.5. And I think we often make it sound so simple, and that binary thinking as opposed to just binary language, but the binary thinking, one thing has to be greater than or of course we have to give up or trade off, and that means that it's going to impact on innovation, on creating, on making mistakes and on learning ultimately.
But that oversimplification or that belief that there is a safety 1, safety 2, I can see where that's super attractive, and I can see where somebody maybe who's not as what's the word for it? Who's not thought about this as much. No, that seems elitist. Someone who's coming from the old view would see safety 2 as kind of a threat. How have you worked through the idea that this isn't a threat to compliance, that what you're talking about isn't saying compliance is bad and people are better? It's sort of a maturity of the way we see safety.
Yeah, I think, one of the ways that I deal with that, I think, and sorry, the line just dropped there a bit, and I think I got most of your question. One of the ways I deal with that, I guess, is I've tried to drop safety from the language as best I can. And the reason that I do that is I try to think about risk. I try to think about decision making, and particularly the words trade-offs and then the associated byproducts. And that for me gets me thinking in a much deeper way about risk than just the idea. I think is that safety has got to is that it's either safe or not safe. And I know that's way too simplistic. And most people, when you get in conversation with them about that, agree with that and can recognise it. I think a lot of people do, but for a range of social reasons, including the law and the way that regulators talk and the way that I think the industry has, and I say the industry is a fairly broad collection of thinking, if you like, has taken us down, is that easily seduced path of thinking that things are safe or unsafe, or we've got to be compliant or not. And so I think if we took safety out of the language as best we can and tried to replace it with risk and think about what risk means and how we all take risk every day, and that risk is both positive or can have positive and negative outcomes and is about trading off one thing for the other, then perhaps that helps us think in a more critical way about it.
Well, how do you define risk?
Isn't that a great question? I try to think of it as the effect of uncertainty, and I also try and think of words. I struggle to give you a definition with words. I think it's really about understanding the social, because I think you have to understand the social context to understand risk. And I think we have to understand learning, which is often an outcome of risk. And so I usually use those words and prompt a conversation rather than try to spit out a sort of a one-sentence definition, if you like. I do provide a definition if needed, but I prefer it as a conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Have the conversation. Let's hear it. Let's hear what you would say to us about this notion of risk.
I think it's, I try to encourage that it's a subjective term, or I try to think myself at least that it's a subjective term. And so when the conversation turns to risk, it's about how do we have a holistic understanding of it? Because risk is often seen as what's faced in front of me and I've got to make a decision about this or about that. But the reality is the things that impact my decisions about the things in front of me are mostly hidden, in our unconscious, and there's a range of social factors that impact on that decision. So if we just focus on risk as an object or as an activity, if you like, that behaviour-based safety tends to take us down that path of, I think we narrow our view of risk. And I think if we instead try to have a conversation like you and I are having here, and when we're talking about the definition together, then I think that can lead to a much richer discussion and a richer assessment, which is ultimately what we all want to do of what risk means.
Well, so I kind of think of risk, Robert, like I think of the word temperature.
Yeah.
That the word temperature isn't really a word that has meaning. The actual meaning is the temperature. So if it's 76 degrees Fahrenheit, right, that's a temperature. That's a temperature. But the word for that, the word temperature, actually is a way to understand the potential gamut of all the answers it could possibly have. I don't know if that makes it easier or harder to explain risk, but when you start looking at risk like the word temperature, risk takes on a whole new meaning, because you can say, what is the risk? And then the answer to that is not risk. The answer to that is, whatever the risk is. Does that make sense? I mean, does that work in your frame?
I think I need a little bit more introduction just to, I guess, if I think of it as a temperature, then does it not force me to think of it as something that's high or low? Is that, or am I hearing you incorrectly?
Well, I mean, you're going to have to assess temperature, but temperature itself doesn't come with any meaning. The meaning for the word temperature is actually in the Fahrenheit or Celsius degrees, right? And it could be high, it could be low, it could be perfect, it could suck, it could be too cold, too hot. It would all be really dependent on who the person was and what temperature they found comfortable. What I think is interesting is that the word itself, temperature, doesn't really hold the meaning. I mean, it's just a word that we use to define sort of the way we assess and understand and talk about whatever the degrees of Celsius or degrees of Fahrenheit it is currently at the time. And I know that's a dangerous way to think of it, because it forces you into kind of Newtonian linear thinking. Well, we can measure the risk precisely like we measure temperature. Well, that's not really what I mean. What I mean is that the word temperature itself has a meaning, but it isn't a specific meaning.
Yeah, I wonder if, and in my work, I guess, and certainly my learning in the last few years, Carl Vick, who I think we're becoming very familiar with now in the work of safety, but he talks about in the social psychology of organising having a consensually validated grammar. And I wonder if that's the real heart of what you and I are talking about here, is that until we actually get that consensually validated, in a group, understanding of what we mean by certain words, I wonder if that actually is one of the biggest risks or biggest challenges, if you like, that we face, is that there's so many, and I don't mean definitions written in sentences, but there's so many different meanings of what we mean as risk. And I think you providing the metaphor of temperature can be helpful, and then we can have a discussion about that. But as soon as we use the word risk on its own without having that discussion, it can mean anything to it. Well, it can mean many things to many people, and I think that's a good point.
And you're right. I mean, Carl, who's just amazing. I love Carl. Carl, even before Carl talked about it, Worf and Sapir talked about the fact that meanings to words are in people, not in the words themselves, that we give sort of a socially accepted collective meaning to words. And one of the things I think we're doing in this new safety journey is actually redefining lots of words. One of the things for sure that I spend my time doing is redefining the definition for what safety is. And I will tell you, safety's not the absence of an accident. Safety is the presence of capacity. It's the presence of the ability to manage that capacity. You could talk to Daniel, Hammerdal, and get the appreciative, absence of the negative, presence of the appreciative. I mean, you can get lots of, and the way we define those words are really important. Really what I'm boiling down to is the way we make sense out of that, which is what Carl talks about all the time, this idea of sense making. And that's crazy interesting to me, because when you bring sense making into a safety discussion, wow, you've stepped way beyond compliance. You've stepped way beyond the federal regulations for scaffolding. Now you're talking about sense making. How'd you make that happen? Because the book you have out now is remarkable in the way it talks about, really ponders with poetry and with pictures, and it's actually a really beautiful book. It ponders the notion of sense making and safety. Tell us about that.
Cool, thank you. It's the book itself was the origins of that were just reflections that were never intended originally to come together in a book. But one of the things that I've realised that I guess this is a personal reflection. It's my own personal introspection of how I was going about life, was that it was just so fast paced, and particularly when I was working in a role of safety in an organisation in manufacturing or wherever it might have been, that I never took the time out to stop and reflect and really think about one, who I was in that situation, and secondly, and more importantly, who were others in the situation. And so it got me to that got me to a point where I started studying, and the study was a social psychology of risk. And that study is really about understanding people, our social arrangements and decision making. And as I was learning that, there were way too many aha moments for me to ignore. So I started to journal, and many of the drawings, particularly the cover on the book, is a reflection of that journaling, where it was really trying me to understand how I was making sense of things. And then in order to support others, or to try and make sense of how others were making sense of things. And I realised that, my approach to safety, if I'm quite frank and honest with myself, was really about controlling, and the word that I use often is crusading. And whilst I reckon I had good intentions, when I sat back and reflected, I recognised that I fell for the far too common trap that people fall for, which was this whole idea that safety is common sense. And that reflection on that term itself, and thinking about what it really means when people say that, helped me to come to the work of Carl Bake and others around sense making, and go, it can't be, and we're fooling ourselves if we think it's as simple as common sense, and of course we can't all have the same sense. So that really got me thinking about, what does sense making mean? How do we make sense of things? And that brought me to the whole understanding of the social arrangements and decision making.
And so you put together this book, this collection. Really, it really is a collection of essays, and most of them are 1 or 2 pages long. I mean, it's a super attractive book. It's almost perfect to read, because you can pick it up at any time and actually get a complete idea in a couple minutes and set it down if you've got other things to do. It's really kind of a nice reader. What do you hope to gain from that? What's the goal in sharing those sort of personal journey notes with the wider safety public?
Good question. I think if this book creates the space for others to reflect, if it provides the motivation or supports the motivation for others to sit down and really reflect on our own ways initially, and then reflect on how we're interacting and how we're being with others, I'd be really stoked. One of the ways I start the book is a reflection of a great mate of mine, a school friend. And without going through the whole story, but Bevo, his name, he and I were great mates at school, but we were also the greatest of enemies from time to time. We loved to hate each other and hate to love each other. But the story that I tell is of his unfortunate death. And Bevo was atop of a moving train maintenance carriage, and it came across a bridge. And reflecting on Bevo's life, who died at the age of 27, was a great way for me to come to a realisation of some sense making. And ordinarily in safety we choose to tell those kind of stories and try and draw, well, certainly what I have done in the past is tell those kind of war stories with the intention of saying, hey, this is really serious, you should listen to this and you should act more safely. Really, to draw back to your point before about Edgar Schein, I mean, what reflecting on Vivo's story did for me was just help me understand that sometimes there's just no answers. And sometimes, as much as I want to make sense out of something doesn't make sense to me. You know, it can be absurd. If I wanted to try and think about it in a rationalist, logicalist kind of way, you know, the reality is that in 27 years, he probably did what most people would hope to do in their lifetime, and he had a pretty good life. And why he left the earth early, I got no idea. But reflecting on the life that he had has been quite an inspiration for me in the book. And I guess it's also led me to think that, you know, sometimes there are no clear-cut answers, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't stop asking questions, though.
And those questions are powerful. And I think that part of the journey, the whole book's really it's like, I don't know, it's like a drink of cold water. It's just a refreshing experience to read the book, because the whole book, you really move from sort of classical definitions, classical understandings of what a safe and stable system looks like to a much broader, much more appreciative understanding of really what social sense making and how really safety is created. And it's created by groups of people or by people doing work in real time, constantly addressing risk as risk moves back and forth in and out of the work they do. And I think that's quite remarkable. It's a real gift to the community. It's a great, great book. I mean, it's quite wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. That means a lot. And I guess one of the things, as I do appreciate that, though, is that, you know, it was a struggle in itself in some stages to write a book that didn't really have answers when I was seeking answers. And I think that was the real key moment for me when, you know, I think in there I use a quote by an old Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, where he talks about a search for the truth, and you know, the fact that we actually got to, you know, the search. If we think we've found the truth, then I think we get trapped. And you know, I think I guess one of the things that really struck me is how simplistic my thinking was when I worked in a field that was so focused on, you know, the black and white view of safe, and I really didn't have a grey in between. And when I think about a search for the truth, if I think about, you know, what the answers are, and I feel really comfortable holding a paradox, I feel comfortable with two things coexisting that don't seem to coexist. That's not the training. That's not the learning that I did when I learned about safety. You know, I learned about the safety of objects. I learned about the legislation, and I could quote those things. Yet I didn't come out of those things as a scientist, or I didn't come out of that thing as a lawyer. But often I thought I was both of those things, and the reality is I wasn't.
That's interesting, because I was just talking with Sidney Decker a couple nights ago, and he was talking about a book that he's playing around with, where we really are sort of at a point now where we're on more of a philosophical journey, but the product of that philosophical journey is actually safer, more reliable systems. And I think that paradox is really interesting.
I think if you ask me the purpose of the book, or I hope it can create more thinking, critical thinking. I don't mean to think for a second that people don't think already, but you know, it's such a seduction, it's such a temptation to get into a world that we live in now that's so full of information, yet we have so much more information available, yet we're really not critically thinking about it. We take a snippet of this or a short YouTube clip and we think we've got knowledge, and sure, we might know something, but what have we really learned, and how do we critique things, and how do you do that if you don't take time out to reflect, and how do you do that if you don't really know yourself? And you know, when I learned safety in the academy of university, there was no talk about ontology, about how we learn. There was no talk about ontology as in who we are. There's no talk about epistemology, all these words that have come to me in the last few years that have helped me understand how I learn. They've helped me understand that indoctrination and getting people to pass a test is really not about learning. we might as well just open their head up and pour information in. Those words in a more philosophical perspective, and I don't think everyone needs to run off and do a philosophy course, but I think the more deeply we think about things and critically we think about things, the better we'll be able to support people in making their decisions. And at the same time, I guess just tying it back to the point I made before, but sometimes there will be no easy answers, and sometimes things will continue to fascinate us and seem absurd because maybe sometimes there are no logical, rational answers to things.
Wow, so what'd you think, huh? Holy cow, a cosmological ending to a wonderful podcast. Robert Sams is pretty remarkable. Let me give you a quote from chapter 2, right out of his book. It's kind of the theme quote, but I like it a lot. Life is either a daring adventure or it's nothing. Security does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience security. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than exposure. That's Helen Keller, but it's actually in Robert Sams' book, which is called Social Sensemaking, a reflective journal, How We Make Sense of Risk. What a great podcast. It's crazy what we do for a living. It was so much easier when it was black and white. It was so much easier when the black line told the story and all you had to do was be obedient. That was easy. It was so much easier when we could identify at-risk behaviors and tell people to stop it. Dang it. That all went away. Where'd it go? Where did it go? Oh, the pain, the existential strife. But that is the podcast. Thanks for listening, you guys. You're always welcome. It is so much fun to have you on board. You know, you make the podcast go. Without you, this thing would be super, super boring and kind of lonely, I think, at some level. Until then, learn something new every single day. I bet you did today. Have as much fun as you possibly can. And for goodness sakes, be safe.